In Rhodesia, a new tactic was invented to deal with the terrorist guerrilla groups. Let's have a look at Fireforce. So 1975-1976, we're looking at the end of the Rhodesian Bush War. The Bush War technically it starts in 64 with the murder of a white Rhodesian. 65 is when it really starts to kick off. Leaders are arrested of the two major groups, Zanla and ZANU, and these both have paramilitary guerrilla forces. Both are pretty much your run-of-the-mill African communist guerrilla groups, and Rhodesia, of course, being declaring a unilateral declaration of independence on the 11th of November 1965 from Great Britain. Great Britain had employed a policy of no independence without majority rule. The white Rhodesians objected to this. There was constant talks for the next 15 years of the handover process. We're not going to look into the process of that right now. We're going to look at Fireforce. So the Rhodesians have a problem. But prior to 75, the Portuguese are run by a fascist dictator. He actually died a few years earlier, but his regime was still in power. And the Portuguese in Mozambique were more than happy to allow the Rhodesians to cross into Mozambique and attack any groups who were stationing themselves in Mozambique. But after the Carnation Revolution, a few years earlier, the Portuguese gave Mozambique over to local forces, and they basically announced themselves as communists after they'd taken power, as you do. Same with Castro and the sort. So this group declares themselves to be communists, and they allow the guerrilla groups to operate out of Mozambique. You could technically call them a state. I wouldn't call them a state sponsor of terrorism, because they definitely were sponsoring terrorism, but with the Rhodesian situation especially, they were more facilitating terrorism. So what they would do is they would have the camp, and they would have a weapons stockpile somewhere else. So if you were one of these guerrillas and you wanted to go into Rhodesia to do a farm attack or attack a garrison or an outpost or something, you would have to go and get your weapons from the Mozambique military, which is at least compliance as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, and after the Carnation Revolution, no deaths, by the way. It's a anyway different story in Portugal. The Rhodesians just basically ignore the Mozambique government telling them they can't cross the border, and just do it anyway, as you do. If Rhodesia has the whole Bush War I won't go into it, but basically the Bush War is a prime example of why you shouldn't cry wolf. Because if you keep crying wolf on both sides, then the people just keep escalating. I mean, almost the meme that comes out of the Bush War is that every single terrorist guerrilla camp is a registered UN refugee base, including the one we're going to look at in this video in Operation Eland. But first we're going to get to Fireforce. Sorry, I know it's a bit long. But basically, and every single camp is, it's a refugee camp, and then every time the Rhodesians attack it, they get international outcries against them. And it's the same with every single Rhodesian military outpost is a civilian. So anyway, it's the same. You shouldn't cry wolf, especially in a war where international pressure is basically just meaningless, because the Rhodesians are going to get it anyway, and the various communist groups are all being supported by the Soviet bloc era. I say Soviet bloc. The Soviets had a group, the Chinese had a group, and the North Koreans were financing. Anyway, that's more of a tangent. Sorry. Fireforce. Fireforce was the Rhodesian government's way of quickly responding to threats, and Fireforce is actually pretty revolutionary. What they would do is the Salute Scouts, or a member of the public, or a member of the military, there was actually a phone line you could just call on a phone to get in contact with the RLI, the Rhodesian Light Infantry, or the Rhodesian SAS, or just someone in the government, as like, there's guerrillas around my farm, or we found a guerrilla camp, we think it's a bit sus. And the Salute Scouts would go and investigate. Salute Scouts were a pretty brutal organization I'm not going to get into. Basically Delta mixed with the KGB with a bit of SS in there. Mostly black. A lot of ex-guerrillas were in the Salute Scouts. The Salute Scouts were basically the Contra guerrillas, which is pretty much just guerrillas employed by the Rhodesians against the guerrilla forces of Zanla and Zapu. Anyway, of Zapu and Zanla, sorry. So the way Fireforce would work is you would identify a target and you would radio to the most of the time the Rhodesian Light Infantry. Other forces we used to, but most of the time it was the Rhodesian Light Infantry, the RLI. And the RLI would get in a Dakota, World War II era Dakota. There is a World War II era Dakota. 20 men would get in that in 4 groups of 5 called a stick. So you would have a 20 men in 5 sticks of 4. Each stick would contain these are 4 stick members. So again, I can't animate, so we'll just do some fingers. You would have the stick leader. He would have a radio. You would have a stick machine gunner with an MAG. All would have FN FALs. He would have an MAG. Others would have FN FALs or equivalent, the Rhodesian equivalents. You would then have 2 riflemen, one of which would be a trained medic. And that's across the board. So you would have quite a few trained medics. So it was a pretty resource-intensive unit. They would have grenades, they would have rifle grenades, they would have all the tools they needed to deal with this situation. So you would have 20 men in a Dakota. You would then have a K-car, a kill car. That's actually what the K stands for. K is for kill, which is an Alouette 3, I believe, Alouette 3, which is, sorry, in reverse, that is an Alouette. This would have the commander. This is sort of strange. This is how you know if you hear the next thing I say and you think it's really bizarre, that means you've been doing this sort of military history thing for a while. The commander would not actually go on the ground. He would actually stay in the K-car, which is pretty weird because normally, especially Paratroopers, the commander is the first one out of the plane. This is a lieutenant, so it's not a lieutenant or a captain. It's not a high-ranking officer. So it's sort of strange in that the lieutenant would be overseeing the operations. The K-car would have a 2-centimeter auto gun or some sort of equivalent, and this would have HE rounds, which would be used to do horrendous carnage. Most reports come out saying that they never really found a lot of people who were wounded by this thing. You were dead if this thing hit you. They would deliberately also target rocks and outcrops to airburst these things. Anyway, and along with the Dakota and the K-car would be 3 G-cars. G for, I don't know, there were 3 G-cars. These are Alouettes as well, with 4 men each. So this would be, again, another 3 sticks. These would be the commander's wild cards. So what would happen would be the commander would arrive first in the K-car. He would start doing some laps, identifying something. You have a few options. As the commander of, you're the commander of a Fireforce, and there's a village. You have been told that there are guerrillas in the village. You've been told that there are guerrilla sympathizers in the village. So you arrive in your K-car and you do some laps. You see a whole bunch of middle-aged men just sitting around with guns, and they scatter into this sort of field area. So you go, right, this is legit. You call in now you have 3 options, sorry. You have a lynx, which is not a lynx, it's not this kind of lynx. So, it's not that kind of lynx. It's this kind of lynx. It's a sort of converted ground attack aircraft. So you can just use that, but you don't really want to do too many civilian casualties. It's not a major issue if you do, but you're trying to avoid it. You also have your 20 paratroopers who can jump out of a Dakota. These guys would do 3 jumps a day if they had to. So these were veteran airborne troops. They would jump into any terrain. If there wasn't a suitable landing zone, you jumped anyway. So you can send any paratroopers, or you can use your G-cars. And what they would do with the G-cars is the G-car would come down, and then the G-car would take off. And you have no idea if the men got out of that G-car or if the men are still in the G-car. They would make repeated dummy landings with these things. So if you're doing a war game, this is perfect for dummy counters and tokens. It's not often you see dummy tokens with a regular force, but if you could make rules for it, it'd be quite good. So you could use your Alouettes, your G-cars to make dummy landings. What they would often do is they would set up a screen force. So they would go, right, the commander would go, okay, look, there's a gully down there that they're going to run through because that's just the clearest terrain that they've got. It's just scrub and a nice clean gully. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop 2 sticks at the mouth of that gully and 1 stick over sort of this other area here. And I'm going to have my paratroopers drop in to the south. And the paratroopers would then form a long sort of line and push their way towards the gully and drive the enemy into the 2 sticks traps, into the tramp of the sticks. They would go into towns. There's footage. I'm not going to show it because it's actually pretty brutal and intense of the RLI in action. They would go into your huts, and if they found anything that linked you to guerrillas, they would arrest everybody and take them back. One of the main successes of Fireforce is that it was quick. You could base a Fireforce anywhere that you had a runway for the Dakota and the Lynx. That's the only two things you needed for the Fireforce. The Alouettes were only 4-man helicopters, hence the 4-man sticks. So you really couldn't deploy huge amounts of men. Sometimes you would have combined fire forces of two groups, almost like a small company type deal. You would have, yeah, and these guys are also sometimes known as Eskimos, because they would go into the frozen zone, where most of the other RLI would not operate. These guys were covering vast areas, huge farms, huge border outposts. If you got attacked, you called the Fireforce. The Rhodesian military by this point had equipped were equipping some of their reserve troops with Lee Enfields from the Second World War. Rhodesia actually sent the most people per capita to the military for the Second World War on behalf of the British Empire. And now they were reusing Lee Enfields on patrol. There's combat footage of people using Lee Enfields in the Rhodesian Bush War. The terrorist forces were mostly using AK-47s and SKS semi-automatics, PPSH semi-automatics, Mosin Nagants from World War II as well. So this was pretty much just the one where the Russians, the Chinese and the North Koreans just dumped all their excess weapons they didn't want anymore. T-55 shot really towards the very end. There's not a lot of tanks at all. This is not a tank war. The Rhodesians get some tanks, I believe T-55s as well, from the South Africans, who in turn got them from somebody else. They seized them in some port and gave a few to the Rhodesians on the sly. As far as I'm aware, there were never major tank battles in Rhodesia. This was called the Bush War for a reason. This was a guerrilla war. It was a war of response. The Rhodesians were mostly either responding to a guerrilla attack, or the guerrillas were responding to an attack on their base. There weren't a lot of pitched battles. There wasn't a lot of maneuvering. It was really a war of innovation. The first MRAPs, mine-resistant armored personnel carriers, they were, I don't know if that's what MRAP stands for, but that's what I'm going to say. It stands for. Anyway, the first MRAPs were developed by the Rhodesians. The South Africans would actually vastly improve them, but that's where the concept comes from. The Rhodesians would also pioneer this Fireforce response to guerrilla attacks, and it wasn't foolproof. I mean, the way you beat Fireforce is you just don't be there when the Fireforce comes. That's where the Grey Scouts comes in. The Grey Scouts were named after a man named Grey. It's different. They were horseback mounted troops, and there's full-on combat accounts of them firing FN-FALs and MAGs on horseback in combat. They charged the enemy because they normally would dismount and fight on foot. They just, for maneuverability, Rhodesia is a very big place. They would actually dismount and fight on foot. But there's actually proven, verified accounts of them fighting on horseback. It's a very interesting war, very strange. So, yep, Fireforce, just to break it down, we'll just break down what's in a Fireforce. What's in a Fireforce is 32 men. It could change a little bit, but we're going to talk about when we talk about what's in a platoon, we talk 3 squads of 10. We're going to talk about what's in a Fireforce, which is 32 men. 32 men in sticks. Sticks are 4-man groups, and of course we do 32 divided by 6, which I'm kind of doing in my head before it catches up to me, is 8. And so 32 divided by 4, is 8. So we have 8 sticks of 4 men each. Each stick contains a stick leader with a radio, a stick gunner with a machine gun, an MAG, and 2 riflemen, both of which are carrying the FN-FAL, or equivalent to it, one of which is a trained medic. And this is the stick. There would be 3 Alouette helicopters, each containing 4 men. So 1 stick per helicopter. The rest would be in a Dakota, an old World War II aircraft, and the commander would be in a K-car, kill car with a 20mm autocannon, and his job would be to monitor the situation from the air in contact via radio. And a Lynx, that kind of Lynx. Again, I'll put more photos. This Lynx here, which is a ground attack aircraft. It's converted. It's not the helicopter Lynx. I originally thought this was the helicopter Lynx, but no, it's not. So might as well just turn this into a tiny little thing of the Rhodesian Bush War. 1979, Ian Smith steps down, hands over to somebody else, and the Bush War essentially ends in 1980 with the formation of Zimbabwe. What we now know as Zimbabwe, which was ruled, of course, by Robert Mugabe, who had killed most of his rivals, and he actually during the election I believe he killed his rival, or his rival died mysteriously in the actual election itself. He ended up with 63% of the vote. He became the new leader of Zimbabwe. It was given its independence. Technically, Rhodesia was actually still part of, it was called Southern Rhodesia, it was still part of the British Empire at this point, but anyway, they declared independence, and now Zimbabwe itself became independent in 1980. And that was the end of the Bush War. A lot of Bush War veterans went to South Africa. South Africans, of course, were involved in their own wars against terrorist groups. The Cubans were involved in South Africa. Russian tanks were involved in South Africa. South Africa is actually a much more sort of conventional style war. It's still a guerrilla war, but it's much more high tech, much more equipment intensive. Sort of all the fun toys come out in South Africa. The Bush War is much more of an infantry war. If you like infantry, I like infantry, then the Bush War is much more up your alley. Anyway, so just quickly talk about Fireforce a little bit more. The main goal of Fireforce was to capture and kill the enemy. The goal of Fireforce was not to scare the enemy away. The goal of Fireforce was not to intimidate the enemy. The goal was to kill or capture the enemy. It was to stop the raid that was happening. It was to take out guerrillas. It was to do things like that. The men who were doing these Fireforces were pretty tough guys. There's an interview you can see. I'll not link to it because it actually shows death. So I don't want to get my channel just banned. Yeah. But there's a video on YouTube you can actually look at, footage of the Fireforce, and in it there is a Lance Corporal who had killed his own brother because his brother was with the communist guerrillas. He knowingly, deliberately, and fully willingly killed his own brother. So that's the sort of people who were involved. Like, these were people who were not going to I don't want to say have mercy, because they would have mercy, they would capture you. But these were not people who were there to sort of, these weren't the guys who were trying to scare the enemy away. These were people, right, we don't stop them here. If we don't kill these guys, they're going to attack a farm. They're going to attack my mates who are in a garrison. They're going to continue to attack the train lines. A big part of Mozambique, cutting off the Rhodesians, is they lost access to major ports through Mozambique. And you can actually see a video of Ian Smith, Prime Minister of Rhodesia. This is pretty devastating. This is an economic kick to the teeth, because now they have to rely solely on these South African train lines. So Mozambique, the Rhodesians pretty much have things not under control, but they have things manageable until Mozambique gets independence. And once Mozambique goes, that's basically the beginning of the end for the South Africa, for the Rhodesian cause. Once I think it's 800 miles of undefended border, they were just completely gone. With Fireforce, you have stop groups and sweep lines. The stop group's job is to engage the enemy. They sit tight, defend a gap, like I was talking about with our men down in the wadi, in the gully. They're a stop group. Then the sweep line, could be paratroopers or the guys in the G-Cars, would push the enemy towards these stop groups. There was a risk of the stop groups being overwhelmed, in which case they would retreat. It's quite easy to hide in the Rhodesian bush. It's quite thick. I'll put a photograph of some. Hey, I got it right. I'll put a photograph of some sort of Rhodesian bush. A lot of the stuff you see these guys fighting in. There is video of this. No, I'm not going to show it. There a lot of stuff you see them fighting in. It's waist to chest high. Very, very easy to hide in. And so yeah, those were your two main groups, and that's pretty much how Fireforce was executed. Thank you very much for watching the video on Fireforce and some other talks about the Bush War. I deviated quite a lot from this one. Leave a like, comment, share, subscribe. That's just what every YouTuber says. I'm not sure if that's actually worthwhile saying. Anyway, let me know if you like more content for the Rhodesian Bush War, or for some stuff in South Africa.